Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Achates live stream today on Tuesday, the 14th of July. There's an ambulance going right past my window at that brilliant moment. I am Kerry Niles, Executive Director of Achates Philanthropy and your host for today's session. I am a cis, straight white female in her 40s with blonde curly hair, and I like to think I'm rocking some really great earrings today. These sessions are brought to you by Achates Philanthropy. We are a creative consultancy with a holistic approach to fundraising. We take our name from Greek and Roman mythology. Achates was the close friend and loyal advisor to Aeneas. We think our name pretty neatly describes the relationship we offer the cultural sector. We set up Achates Live to support the sector, bringing fundraisers together to discuss key topics and also to enable you to help each other. At Achates, we always say we don't have all the answers, but we do have an overview of the cultural sector and we like to use this role in a supportive way. Our live stream started as a series of workshops in conjunction with the Old Vic in London. COVID-19 closures meant that we've moved the series online as we felt it was important to continue our support of the sector through the challenges that the crisis has presented for all of us. Today's session, Diversify to Thrive, is looking at how we can maintain diversity in the sector when the fundamental nature of the sector is changing through the crisis and many organisations are facing closure and/or redundancies. In a slight change to our usual format, I am now going to ask all of our guests to introduce themselves. So I'd like to start with Kane Moore.
Hi. My name's Kane. I am chairing today's conversation. I am a white man in my 30s with green eyes, normally slightly more crazy hair, but it's a little bit sort of more ordered today.
Thank you so much, Kane, for that lovely introduction. Tarek, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, my name's Tarek. I'm Artistic Director at Battersea Arts Centre. I'm a 5'6" Middle Eastern man in my 40s with black hair and brown eyes.
Thank you very much, Tarek. And Michaela, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, I'm Michaela Green. I'm Development Communications Director at the Roundhouse. I'm a white woman in her 40s with blonde hair and about 5'7"-ish, I think.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And Jess Tom, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Jess. I am a white woman who is 40 years old today. I have short, curly brown hair and a very cool wheelchair that the cat is currently sleeping in. Biscuit, I also have Tourette's syndrome, which means I make movements and noises I can't control, called tics. Biscuit, so this will come with extra biscuits. Biscuit, and if you see me making movements that are unusual, that might include swearing at the screen, it's not a comment on what's happening, it's just tics. Biscuit, several times a day my tics intensify and I completely lose control of my body and speech, which looks seizure-like. If that happens during this session, then don't worry, my support worker will come and help me and I'll come back and join you as soon as I can. Biscuit, sausage.
Thank you so much, Jess. And finally, if she is there, I would just like finally at the end of our session, we're going to be joined by our partners, the Achates Philanthropy Prize, with the Achates Philanthropy Golden Nugget. So I'd just like to ask Sandeep, who will be delivering that for us today, to introduce herself as well.
Thanks. Hi everyone. Hi, I'm Sandy and I'm a 40-something brown girl with long dark hair, pink and black stripy dress and Chanel Ruby lipstick. I have the thrilling role of heading up Nottingham's UNESCO Creative City designation. I run the City of Literature charitable company and I also chair the International Network of UNESCO Cities of Literature.
Thank you so much, everybody. And we have one final participant today that none of you can see right now, but over on the YouTube chat, we have our director, Caroline McCormick, who is hosting the chat and fielding your questions today. I can see quite a lot of you have been saying hello to her over there, so that's great. Keep that conversation going. We love you to participate in conversation. We love to have your questions. We will be asking the panel some of your questions later on in the session today. So if anything comes up during the session, or you've come to the session with a really burning question, do please ask. Of course, as I said earlier, we don't pretend that we have all the answers. So we might not be able to answer some of these really big questions that are coming up today, but we will certainly do our best, and we're hoping to have an open and helpful discussion today. Just to caveat all of this, as most of you know, these sessions do stay live on our YouTube channel. So if you are watching this at a later date, all information is current as of today, the 14th of July. So if you are watching later, please bear in mind that responses may have changed, particularly things that are specific to the COVID-19 situation. Those responses may change as the situation continues to develop. So on that note, I am going to hand over to our lovely Development Director, Kane Moore, to kick off the session and start asking those difficult questions of our panel. Over to you, Kane.
Thank you very much, Karian. And thank you so much to our guests, Jess, Tarek, Michaela, and Sandy for joining today. And also a really, really big thank you to Jess for joining us on her birthday. I'm expecting the YouTube live chat to light up with happy birthdays to Jess. I don't think I'm going to force the panel to sing a round of happy birthday at the end, but you never know. So to kick off today's conversation on diversity and representation within the arts and cultural sector, I want to briefly set the scene with everyone's favourite thing, which is a whole load of statistics. So according to the 2011 census for England and Wales, 19.5% of people identified with an ethnic minority group. And yet only 12% of the Arts Council National Portfolio workforce are from a Black and minority ethnic background. For major partner museums, this number drops to 5%. In positions of leadership, only 9% of chief executives and 10% of artistic directors in national portfolio organisations are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. On executive boards at partner museums, it is 3%. According to Scope, nearly 1 in 5 working age adults are disabled. Yet disabled workers make up only 5% of the national portfolio workforce. And less than 1% of national portfolio organisations are disability-led. There are no disability-led museums. At least 6% of the UK population self-identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and the number's definitely more. Yet less than 1% of organisations in the national portfolio are LGBT-led. 45% of the UK population are of working class origin. Yet as identified in Create London's 2018 report, It's an Emergency, a key characteristic of the British cultural and creative workforce is the absence of those from working class social origins, making up only 18% of workers in music, performing, and the visual arts. Although women make up the majority of the workforce across all of the national portfolio organisations, men continue to dominate chief executive, artistic director, and chair positions at nearly all of the major cultural organisations. What these statistics highlight is that whilst initiatives like Arts Council England's Changemakers and Elevate programmes have definitely helped to make the sector more inclusive, it is still in no ways representative of the diversity of the UK, both in terms of its workforce, its creatives, or its audiences. At its best, I believe culture and heritage should hold up a mirror to our society in all its multiplicity, without needing to get on a plane, or has been the case with COVID-19, even leave our houses. It should expand our horizons and introduce us to new perspectives and new ways of seeing the world. Diversity should be a given and not something that we strive for, and I realize the hypocrisy of this statement, continue to debate about. The arts should be the platform for celebrating diversity and equality, promoting understanding and building bridges across communities. Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts. Culture is therefore fundamental to human dignity. An identity and access to, participation in, and enjoyment of culture is really bound up with human rights. So as a sector, we have a duty to ask over and over again, who is not in the room, who is not taking part, who does not feel the arts is for them. We need to maintain a commitment to investing in pipelines for diverse talent and to continue to push for a diverse workforce to open up the arts. But as well as creating these bottom-up approaches, we need to deconstruct the patriarchal and colonial systems we are operating within to allow more flexible and inclusive sector to develop. Okay, I think that's enough from me. Who we do have in the room today is a really brilliant expert panel who I am sure will unpick this question of diversity in the arts with far more eloquence than I can. So I'm going to start by diving straight in with some questions. Okay, I think, Jess, I'm going to hit you with the first one. So at our Achates Live back in June, cultural thinker and fellow Arts Council changemaker Suzanne Allen spoke about diversity and inclusion being drivers for innovation. Jess, from your perspective, why is it important that diversity, be it by race, religion, disability, class, gender or sexuality, is reflected and celebrated across arts and culture?
I suppose the first thing to say is that my view is that public money should benefit the public and not just a very small percentage of those who have the sort of power to access it and control it. It's important to see our communities and ourselves represented in institutions that give voice and shape to our shared culture. I fundamentally don't think public money should be used to uphold barriers of exclusion and discriminatory practices. I mean, at a very basic level, that should be embedded within everything that we're trying to do from a legal point of view, but also and from a social and ethical point of view. But obviously within a cultural sector, from an artistic point of view, it's boring seeing the same stories told by the same people in the same way. And I want to be part of an inclusive community of people who are making, enjoying, and programming art.
I really like without diversity, the sector is boring. Tarek, I just wanted to jump in there and just get your perspective. Does diversity make the sector less boring?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's self-evident. Yes, I guess what I'm listening about is it's interesting that it's quite hard to sit and talk about all the benefits of diversity because the benefits are so obvious, like whether it's innovation, whether it's economic, whether it's creative. I mean, it's almost kind of pointless trying to outline them again and again and again. I guess the more interesting question is if there are so many benefits, why are things not operating in that way, and why are they not structured in that way? And I guess we certainly live in a society that for all sorts of historic but also current reasons and reasons of value are very unequal. And our creative industries and cultural institutions not only reflect that, but in many ways exacerbate it, many ways. I mean, I feel like generally we are part of the problem rather than the hype that we try to tell the world, which is we are part of the solution, which again, going back to those very stark figures, just patently not true. I mean, it's simply not a fact that there are many other industries, organizations that are much more representative and inclusive than we are. So the question is, that needs completely dismantling because the benefits are clearly there, but there are obstacles to doing that. And for me, what's interesting, having started in another industry and coming into this one and trying to learn to be a director and kind of carve out a career, is there's a massive gulf from my perspective of being both a kind of trying to being an artist, but also being on the organizational end. There's a massive gulf between the creativity that happens out in our communities or in our rehearsal rooms, which are hugely creative and fertile places full of imagination, and our organizations and our structures, which are the least creative, the least flexible, the most unimaginative places I have ever experienced. And if you compare that even to other industries or other sectors, it feels like we leave all our imagination out the door. So it seems unsurprising that we struggle to realize those benefits or even imagine something different because we're so trapped in consistent ways of working that are only hindering us.
And so from your perspective, I mean, you spoke about the fact that we often place ourselves as being part of the solution without acknowledging the fundamental problems that exist. I mean, how do we take that forward?
Well, I think we all agree that it's kind of time for less talk and a bit more action. That's kind of evidence, and because, you know, again, it is all smoke and mirrors. It is all hype without any actuality, and it's not that difficult. I mean, it's rather than, I mean, I personally never feel that the sticks are helpful, though I think, you know, everyone should be accountable in different ways. But there are so many amazing examples of people who are representative, are inclusive of all scales and shapes, and yet we not only do we not celebrate those enough, we don't actively learn from those examples or make things happen. And the truth is there just isn't the will to change. And again, I think it's not an ethical question of will. I don't think people are evil. I think it's actually a lack of imagination or a lack of courage or a lack of understanding that the problem is not making new things. It's not putting in more processes and creating more activities to make the world more inclusive. It's taking away all the crap that's getting in the way. There's actually taking so much of our time and energy to keep people out. And Jess, we've learned a lot from Jess and Maddie, who've been very eloquent on this, BAC.
Yeah, Jess, you're massively nodding, and I mean, you know, and Tarek, you're obviously referring to the work the brilliant work Jess and Matthew and Tourette's here have done around relaxed venues, and, you know, changing the concept of you know, how disabled audiences and disabled artists interact with venues, and how you know, exploding that idea that accessibility can be narrowed down just to a few relaxed performances every now and then.
Often, like, I think often my frustration when we're talking about sort of diversity is that it's seen as extra work that you do rather than part of the work that should be happening anyway. And certainly around access, sometimes that's perceived, if you're thinking about making stuff more accessible, that's perceived as putting layers on someone's job rather than just helping someone do the job they should be doing better in a more inclusive and better, fuller way. I think the fundamental issue is that loads of the way that to date the approach to addressing a lack of representation and representativity of the population within the arts force has been fiddling around the edges and trying to put individuals in that system. Fundamentally, we need to change the system, because the system is not an equal division of power, and it doesn't allow for the imaginative creativity of all of us to be visible. It maintains sort of power structures that we've inherited. So I think fundamentally the system needs to change. The exciting thing I think about the situation that we're in now is that it's really hard to change systems when they're up and running. We've had this pause forced upon us through the sort of COVID-19 pandemic. That has demonstrated that everything that we think of as fixed and permanent and unchanging isn't. It can change overnight when it's seen as in everybody's best interests. Disabled people have been asking for home working and increased like online meetings for years and have been told it's impossible. and then overnight it's possible. So all of those things, that's one example of how things that we consider to be really fixed and impossible actually aren't. So hopefully I would really like this to have opened up people's imaginations to the possibility of doing things in different ways. And if we understand that there needs to be a systemic change in order to connect more people to opportunities and to make decisions and be visible and within our cultural institutions, now seems like a good time to start making those shifts. Fab.
Michaela, I definitely want to bring you in at this point. I guess to sort of probably pull into the next question at the same time. I think it's a really good question from Tarek of, if the benefits are really self-evident. Firstly, why are we not operating that way at the moment? And pulling in with what Jess was just talking about, if COVID-19 has suddenly helped to dismantle so many barriers, how do we ensure that those barriers aren't just reinforced as we move out of this?
I think
they're two big questions.
they are. I'm trying to think where to start. They both flagged really critical points. I think firstly, we are in a moment of change, and it's hit our sector enormously. Well, it's hit lots of sectors, but particularly looking at the cultural and creative sector, it's hit us hugely. But we've learned stuff from this. We've pivoted what we've been delivering. We've had to deliver what we've delivering on a lot smaller scale operationally. So, Tarek's point around, we are brilliant at being creative on our stages, in our rehearsal rooms. Why don't we use some of those skills and techniques to look internally and think about how we deliver all this differently? Jess's point around, it's essentially a nice to have, or it's extra work you need to do. That isn't good enough anymore as our sector, and we're all different sized organisations, and some of us will be able to invest more resource in this and do more around this, but it should be embedded in everything that you do as an organisation. We embed it in our business plan. Do we get it right all the time? No, of course not, but it's embedded in what we're trying to achieve as an organisation. It's not it's not on the side that we'll get to when we've got a bit of time to look at it. And I think from the structural change point of view is if it's a piece of work that a group over there in the organisation looks after, and let's just let them get on with it, rather than properly embedding it top down and bottom up. It has to be understood and owned and accountable to and for at board level, at senior leadership level. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve not just success and change in our own organisations, but more widely for the sector. And those stats that you talked about earlier will not change. So I think we have to take this opportunity now, and it's a big challenge for all of us. It's a very difficult time for many organisations and many people, but it is a time for us to pause, as I think Jess was saying, and think, right, how do we reboot, and how we can play a real role in changing what this sector looks like now.
Jess.
I think it's also fair to say that I wouldn't want to give the impression that COVID-19 has reduced barriers for disabled people, because it definitely hasn't. Overnight, those barriers changed, and so you might have spent a lifetime working out how to build a career within a certain set of barriers and sort of structures, and then as our society changes, all of those barriers changed overnight. And certainly for me, and as a disabled artist, this has felt like a time of survival, not so much organisational survival as personal survival, and the survival of other disabled artists, because so many things were felt stacked against us, particularly in the beginning. And so I think one of the things, I think we've got to be aware of not rebuilding with barriers, but not letting old barriers re-emerge. I think that there's a real concern amongst disabled artists and activists that the sort of work that's happened around disability arts and culture of the last sort of 40 years could easily be undone if the sector rebuilds with disabled people still locked down and surviving. And there's, I think, an example of this is how, Tourette's Hero is an arts organisation, but we have pivoted away from arts during this crisis to be providing a sort of shopping and delivery service for disabled people, because that was what was needed for our survival. And so how can we expect people to be artists if they can't access food, if they don't feel confident that they'll get access to healthcare, equal access to healthcare, if they can't access the sort of things they need to be safe, social care support? So there's so many, we can't just treat this cultural sector as separate from the barriers that exist in the rest of the world. We need to use creative means to address and equalize opportunity, and that means addressing barriers both within and outside the sector, and not being quiet on the politics of exclusion and, you know, and systemic oppression.
And I think there's something really fundamental there about, you know, particularly if you look at those organizations that I think stand up as really flag bearers for their communities. It's what you see, you know, from say the support that Fuel's offered to particularly with freelance artists, say Farnham Maltings, the role that they played with their community in Farnham and Surrey. I think it's really interesting, you know, and the same with the work that that you've done, Jess, that we've spoken about with disabled artists who are shielding, is just, I think those organizations that have really, I think, started a dialogue or tried to understand what the issues are that their communities are facing, however they define that, by geography, by background, and have thought of innovative and creative ways of responding. I think that's, yeah, for me the issue is, it's a really valid one of how we ensure that we don't, though today, you know, COVID-19 might have dismantled certain barriers, how it potentially has erected new ones. And I guess from this, how do we take forward what is working so well, and how do organizations maybe balance operating in slightly different ways to deliver their mission with their core activity going forward? Tarek, what was your thoughts?
I mean, I guess the thing that I think there's certain things we all share in common, and I think one of the things we all share as people is usually we're quite curious, and usually we like to solve things or like to be proactive. And I guess part of the difficulty is the questions or the problems we've been trying to solve pre-COVID were not useful questions when you're thinking about universal access or how to be representative. So if your concern is being financially viable, or your concern is shifting tickets to a particularly narrow demographic, or your concern is making something that you think you want to project into the world, that's not particularly helpful. But in this environment, because all your assets for most cultural organizations have been completely taken away overnight, suddenly the only thing you can do is ask different questions, like who is out there, what do they need, what is our role, what skills or assets can we bring to the fore that aren't tied to things. So suddenly your whole frame completely changes, and that suddenly is quite enabling, and people can be quite curious and excited about that. So whereas before you may be trapped as, say, kind of a lack of very narrow thinking about, oh, how do we get automatic doors to work in our building, or how do we, you know, make our booking system so completely a little bit more accessible than the complete nonsense that most websites are for most people to access, to actually deeper questions about how do we communicate with people, how do we assess what our use is at this moment, what does creativity mean, and what point is it, and what can we do at this moment when people actually need it? It's much more fundamental, and I think that opens a door to inclusion that didn't exist before. I guess that's why I guess I'm very wary of the language of let's go back. They recognize people are hurting and everyone is suffering, and obviously no one really wanted this to happen in any way whatsoever. But we have to recognize the past was full of closed doors for a lot of people, and was also closed doors in our own minds. We weren't asking broad questions, deep questions, because we couldn't get ourselves away from the day-to-day.
So Michaela, I mean, so what therefore does a more inclusive cultural sector look like post COVID-19?
Realised I was still on mute, sorry. I think picking up on Tarek's point, it's about taking this time now to listen and understand those barriers more clearly, and looking, for me, and a big part of what we've been doing is trying to, listening to our staff, looking at what those barriers are. And I'm thinking here more of the internal, and at what levels, and how do we start making change? I think it was Tarek said earlier, you know, the time for talking needs to stop. The time for action now needs to happen. And how do we, individually as our own organisations, but also collectively as a sector, what's been really powerful over the last few months has been the number of voices that have been speaking up that we've been able to listen to, and also reflect ourselves as organisations around how we make change. And I think that's the critical part now, is having a real clear action plan, and listening to one another and supporting one another, supporting each other in the sector. We're all different organisations, but there is of course a commonality of creativity. So how do we listen and support one another to make these changes?
And I guess, I mean, so Tarek, do you genuinely believe that the status quo won't just reinforce itself going forward?
I totally believe. I mean, I think anyone who believes that the status quo in any form is coming back anytime soon is living in a fantasy world, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if you just look at what has happened in our communities and society as a whole, I think a lot of it is not very visible because we're still, to a greater or lesser extent, locked down and separated from each other. But things have fundamentally changed, and we're clearly going to be in a long haul, and that is going to be super hard for everyone in different ways, but we have to make the best of it. Just picking up what Michaela said, I think one really important thing is for us to take advantage of the moment, and for us to really use this as a way of changing ourselves for the better, we also have to be careful about the language we use and supporting each other, because of the sheer level of risk, because of the sheer grief that everyone's experiencing over realities that have disappeared or people have disappeared. Some of the narrative kind of in our general conversation can be very negative and can be very, let's burn it all down, let's break it all because it wasn't working. And though I totally share and understand that sentiment, I don't think that's the way to get the changes that we all want. As I say, there is a way of reframing this that's much more positive, which is we want to address these problems. We have an opportunity now to address them. A lot of the barriers that we all faced, because a lot of the barriers are internal within organizations as well as external, have disappeared. I just feel we could generally really support each other. I think there's a risk that if we bash each other a bit too much, because of the positive desire to get quick change and get action done, it may be slightly self-defeating.
And I guess, I mean, at the same time that, you know, there is a way that you can find a positive through line to COVID-19. I think, you know, the recent survey by Creative Access, as part of their More Than Words campaign, just, I mean, highlighted that there's art workers from, you know, more underrepresented communities that are more likely to be in entry level, trainee or front-facing roles that are now most at risk as a direct result of COVID-19. So I guess in terms of reimagining the sector, how do we at the same time ensure that we don't shed diverse talent? How do we ensure that we can, you know, that we have a more representative sector post COVID-19, whilst understanding that it's a sector that is probably going to shrink? Jess, can I go to you for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in a slightly different position because I'm not linked. We don't have a space. We don't have a building. We don't have that sort of, I think one of the things about Tourette Zero that's always felt really important to us is that we can be really responsive to the needs of our community rather than to the shifting agendas of funders or sort of trends. So I think for us, it feels like we can go where we're needed, and we can do that relatively quickly, and because we're small and disabled led, that works in a particular way. So I feel like we are looking for, our focus has been on trying to address some of the practical barriers that people experience in their day-to-day lives, and doing that without question, without the need for sort of evidence, with innate understanding, love and solidarity, and embodying sort of kindness within that, which is exactly how we would approach making, you know, artwork or creating change within an organization. And I think we do that so that people can then can make art, contribute to the sector, be creative, because you can't do that if you're worrying about the very practical thing. So that, I suppose that's our way, like our direct way of trying to sustain the sector, is to help people survive this bit of time. And I think it's very tempting to try and make big plans. I think rather than making big plans, and we need to think of like practical models for how we engage, methodologies and models for how we engage with communities and listen to what people need and respond appropriately, and do that from a point of solidarity, kindness and love. And that is that there needs to be a flexibility and understanding in sort of funding models to allow that to happen.
Tarek, Michaela, you're both nodding. Can I go to either of you? Who's first to unmute? Go on, Michaela.
I think, yes, it is a risk. You know, the sector is about to go through a lot of change, and I think we need to be conscious of this. And we do need long-term strategies. I think it's about, from an organisational structural point of view, it's about understanding your metrics. You know, what's a crude and brutal level, what's your data telling you about your workforce, and how do you have strategies at all levels of your organisation to make change. And things like target setting are sometimes a bit controversial, sometimes seen as laborious, but it gives you a pathway to move through as an organisation, looking at your, you know, everything from your recruitment to your employee engagement strategies, as well as your entry-level workforce strategies. So I think it's about, as I said earlier, having now to take the time, and time is challenging, post-COVID, pre-COVID, is always challenging. And it's about being realistic about what you can achieve and by when, and setting those parameters and clearly communicating that with your workforce and your board to ensure that everyone not just buys into it, but holds you accountable for it, so that it gets done and we make change.
Tarek.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I think so. The sad reality is that a lot of diverse people are in entry-level roles within organizations, because over the years we've been very poor in supporting people through those careers, and so a lot of people drop out, and we've just over the decades just had people trapped. And restructures and responses to different moments will be different. This one, because of what's happening and the way that it prevents people from accessing venues, for example, means that disproportionately this restructure isn't going to be about management or middle management. It's going to be around frontline roles, which are no longer as relevant as they were. And that's the sad reality. So we know it's going to impact people. I guess the question, again, the question is, rather than just keep the structures we have or move the deck chairs around a little bit, I guess, going back to Jess's point about really listening, this is also a moment where we could really engage with our communities, with our partners, with people themselves, to work out what roles we actually need in this new world, which could be very different from the structures that we had before. And those may be massively brilliant opportunities to recruit people from different backgrounds into those roles. So it creates new opportunities. And it's hard, I don't want to sound blasé, because the reality is we are talking about a lot of colleagues, friends, who may lose their jobs as part of this process. But I mean, zooming out of it, if we're looking at the industry, or whatever we want to call it, the sector, there may be an actually opportunity there, but we need new roles, not to try to fill in the old pockets that we had before.
And in terms of who drives that, I mean, you know, you talking with your arts council, your sort of pre-arts council hat on, Tarek, is it, whose responsibility is it to drive change? Is it funders? Is it public opinion? You know, particularly thinking around the pressure the Black Lives Matter movement has put on to address fundamental inequalities. Where does responsibility ultimately lie, and should that responsibility be forced?
Well, the truth is, with all these systemic changes, the responsibility is with all of us, and none of us can shirk that responsibility, because all of us in different ways, in micro ways and macro ways, need to make a difference. Saying that, though, with my old hat on, I do think funders in particular have a particular role to enforce, or at least set the agenda, set the theme. And I think, in fairness, places like the Arts Council have tried to do that, but not nearly fast enough, not nearly deep enough.
Jess?
Biscuit, I agree with Tarek that the responsibility is shared, and it certainly shouldn't fall on marginalised groups to be constantly, begging for inclusion and begging for crumbs. I think that we need a more even redistribution of power and the sort of resources that go along with that. But I think that there is a real issue with actually listening to and connecting with people who have lived experience and lived experiences that, because that's certainly lots of the barriers that I've experienced as a disabled person during the last 4 months many of them have been the result of people not thinking about a diversity of bodies and minds when they've been creating systems or schemes or opportunity. Disabled people have been routinely forgotten from various strategies, and constantly having to and accessibility has at various times been dropped because it's an emergency and it's a crisis response. So I think it's really important that we don't drop the things that allow us to listen and hear and engage and connect with more people. And I think it's very easy in times that are challenging, and I think we saw this under austerity as well. It's very easy for organisations to look inwards when they feel under pressure and threatened, and actually what we need to be doing is everybody needs to be connecting outwards, listening, thinking, being led by lived experience, but having shared responsibility, and fundamentally taking some labour away from marginalised people, because it's tiring to constantly be having to advocate for your position within a to exist, essentially.
Yeah. In terms of listening, I think we're probably at the point now where we should probably let some other voices into the conversation. So I'm going to get Karen to throw in some questions that we might have had from the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Kane. The biggest thing we've had come through on the chat today is almost everyone wishing Jess an extremely happy birthday. I've promised faithfully that I won't sing, so don't worry, I'm not going to sing to you, Jess. But there's been a lot of love for you over there, Jess, for doing this on your birthday. So from everyone on the stream and from all of us, thank you and huge happy birthday. So to throw this over to the floor, we've had a few questions come in. There's two that I'd like to focus on, I think, because we are slightly running out of time. Just going back to what's been said in the conversation so far today, Hester Cockcroft has asked, what lessons can we take from our artistic practice that we can apply practically in reconfiguring our organisational hierarchies, power structures? I think that's a super interesting question. I think, Tarek, that ties into what you were saying. So can we get your opinion on that?
Oh my God, I was shrinking my chair thinking, please don't ask me. This is such a complicated, I mean, there is literally no way in like a minute to talk about it. But I mean, there is something, I guess this is going to be a very basic answer, but I guess if we're thinking about the most traditional forms of performance and sort of development, there is something interesting about the fact that we take a very contingent approach to putting together the skills and abilities that are needed for a particular outcome. So you don't rehearse a play. I mean, you may have certain roles or skills as a director or whatever, but even companies kind of vary those. We have very flexible models of how we incubate creative ideas or creative practice. And also when we do it well, we also allow different timescales So we don't fix things and say, and that's why the kind of 4-week, 3-week rehearsal models is actually not the best one to work with. So I guess there's something for me about how can we develop organizations that are more flexible, nimble, and more contingent, and can be put together in a modular way with the right people, the skills much more porously, than having a kind of core team constantly underlying everything, which can be resistant to change in the way things operate. That's like off the top of my head for a very complex question.
Yeah, thank you, Tarek. I agree. It's a massive question. So when we were preparing for this session yesterday, Kane and I were kind of skirting around some of these ideas, and you're absolutely right. One of the things we said yesterday was it's impossible to answer some of these questions in an hour live stream. As a sector, we haven't managed to answer these questions in the last 30 plus years. Hopefully, there is a moment now where we can start to think about them. Jess, do you have anything to add on that question?
So when we were preparing for this session, Kane asked Matthew, who's the co-founder of Tourette Zero, and I a question about whether our experiences of pandemic had sort of made us ask any big searching questions as an organization, whether it had made us sort of question what we do and how we do it. And we both very quickly, and like whether we changed anything, we both very quickly were like no, like the activity that we're actually doing looks very different, but the way that we do it, I think, is driven by some really clear values, beliefs, principles, and shared aims. And I think sometimes that might be easier in smaller organizations to get to a position of sort of really intense understanding of why you're doing something in a particular way. And I think that some of those questions and some of that, like the motivation for doing something needs to feel real and truthful and honest. And that's the same as if you're making an authentic piece of performance. If you're thinking about putting something creative together, it's got to have a sort of like a heart to it. And I think that same process needs to be informing how we are putting together organizations and responses to and we need to not fall into patterns of charity model patterns, essentially. And I think that's one of the things that is different about, for example, how we've been responding to disabled people's needs for food. We're not providing people with food packages, we're doing people shopping for them and delivering that to them, and we're doing that with the same attention, care, and love that we would and creativity and that we would do if we were making a piece of art. And we're not running an organization, so we haven't got those same, we are not running a big organization, so we haven't got those same challenges. But I think that really interrogating what you want to achieve and why you're doing something is absolutely essential if we're then going to really understand what we need to do, like doing what we need to do and not what we think we should be doing, what we think would look good to or which might work. Like actually really trying to understand the problem and testing out different solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Jess. I'm just really conscious that we're running out of time. We have got, so sorry not to throw that one over to you at this point, Michaela. Given that it's such a big question, you're probably not that sorry. So I would just like to ask one more question, if I may. Can I ask you just to address this relatively swiftly, because we are swiftly running out of time. So we've got a question coming from Kate Wasserberg, or possibly Wasserberg. Apologies to you, Kate, if I've pronounced your name wrong. Her question is, what are your thoughts on transforming the demographic makeup of the sector while also changing cultures to address microaggressions and ignorance encountered by new diverse staff members in companies? I think that's something that I'm sure we've all seen. If you're introducing difference into an organisation, it can be really difficult to change that culture and ensure that person then has a safe space to work in, where their voice can be heard, and where they've got a valid platform to work from that is appropriate to them. Again, it's a big question and it's not an easy question to answer. Michaela, would you like to address this first?
Sure, and I'd shout if I haven't understood your question properly, Kate. we can't shout through, Kieran, is, I suppose, to give an example of this, is how you build it in your policies as an organisation, your welfare policies for your staff, your anti-harassment policies for your staff. And I use that as, it sounds quite a brush off example, but I use it because what it brought up for me in particular was one of my members of staff at the time. She is a young Black woman, Babette, and I'm sure she won't mind me sharing her story, came to me and said, I don't feel some of my peers, some of my colleagues and friends here would feel comfortable about speaking out. And obviously for me, as a director of the organisation, that was horrific news. I was like, you know, talk me through that, Babette, why is that? How can we change that as an organisation? And Babette went off to develop something called the Forum, which is a space for young Black employees at sort of entry and mid-level stages of the organisation, not just at the Roundhouse, but at other organisations, to form a network group, I suppose, to bring that group together, and then fed back anonymously to us and other organisations that were part of that, any concerns, any questions, any issues that had arisen, but in a confidential space that we then could take back and look at how we would address. So I'm not sure if that's answered the question, but it's just, I think there's one example of how we have approached it and are actually approaching it going forward as well, is looking, if your structures, if your processes aren't working, then find a way by communicating with those staff to change it, to make sure you've got the right communication channels that people feel is a safer space for them. And we did a big piece of work after Blackout Tuesday, following the Black Lives Matter campaign. And that was to put all of our staff into smaller working groups to talk about this and then share the findings and pull together our action plan. And what came out of that is even some staff then didn't feel comfortable in those spaces. So it's now our job to find another way for people to communicate and share their thoughts, ideas, challenges and feedback to us as an organisation. So we are hearing everyone.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Michaela. I think I saw you nodding a lot there, Jess, as that question was asked. Would you like to respond briefly on that one as well?
Yeah, I'll respond very briefly. Change making and having non-normative experiences, and trying to operate within a sort of within normative spaces and normative expectations is exhausting, and it's not without. It takes a lot of energy, and it's not. And I think on a very basic level, I think, you know, the Arts Council's Changemaker programme, for example, which I was part of, was brilliant in some respects, but actually it took a huge amount of emotional labour at certain points that I hadn't. You know, change making is not always an easy, nice process, and actually it can often mean drawing on lots of really difficult, challenging lived experiences and representing that over and over again. So I think it's really important that we take some of that labour away from people with lived perspective, with those sorts of with lived experiences, that we understand the emotional impact of, and we put proper procedures and we work in combination. Basically, we need to collaborate with diverse-led organisations. It's all about having not like feeling really connected and having opportunities to voice and give and receive solidarity in those moments. And I think we need to get better at collaborating across the sector and not working in silos, because I think there's very, like, fundamentally you know, we need to take less energy away from people to be drawing attention to and addressing barriers, so that they can get on with having careers, making work, being creative, injecting imagination and energy into the things that they care about, and not just constantly having to draw attention to and fight the same barriers over and over again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jess. I think that was really well said, and I completely agree with you, particularly around the challenges of that Changemaker programme from the Arts Council. I think that the problem with those things is that those schemes are often well-meaning, but exactly it's not, for me, it's not about the position of the people that are in these spaces. The other to make the change all the time. The change has to be cutting across the sector. We all have to be part of the change, or it won't happen strongly enough. So on that note, we are going to go over to Sandeep with our Achates Philanthropy. I can never say that. I struggle with that every single time. The Achates Philanthropy Prize Golden Nugget. So Sandeep, if you are there, we are ready for your nugget. I might need to sign off before the end of Sandeep's nugget, so I'm going to say goodbye to all of you and thank you so much to our brilliant guests for today. Kane, I'm going to have to hand over to you to exit the session when we are finished. For now, I will say over to you, Sandeep, for our golden nugget this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks so much for inviting me. This has been absolutely fascinating and uplifting to hear from people I admire. And I'm proud to virtually stand alongside Jess, Michaela and Tarek, and to have the opportunity to reflect on today's discussion. All of your perspectives have renewed my sense of resolve to do all that I can to further listen, to learn, and to embed the change, both individually and collectively as a sector. And what struck me during this conversation was the idea of solidarity with the common cause of inequality. It affects me because it affects you. And to look at ways to progress, to change the narrative and put our values and leadership into action, to co-create pledges for radical and permanent change, to self-reflect, interrogate, and hold ourselves accountable for driving this change. In my world of literature and libraries, it's been very encouraging to see more people reading more books by Black writers as a way of understanding and expressing solidarity. Books feel like they represent so much, and the writers shortlisted for the Jalak Prize have shown that there is a huge appetite for books that challenge, inspire, and inform. As a woman and as a woman of colour, I have faced enormous barriers to progress. I have consistently worked harder and smarter in order to land my current dream role in Nottingham. And now I get to dream about a new future and drive a conversation about diversity, inclusion and equality as part of the city's recovery and revisioning plan. This is not about what the sector is doing for us. We don't need saving. It's about the sector desperately needing to flip the narrative, to change the story and realise it needs greater representation so that it can become more dynamic, more agile, more creative. As our economic, social and cultural models shift now, we must reimagine fiercely, drawing on alternative ways of working and repurposing spaces and addressing barriers which might mean giving up power. So the questions I'm exploring are, how do we open up in an inclusive way? Who needs to engage and help us dream about the future and reframe what our new offer is going to be? And it's on all of us to be really intentional about that. Having read so many reports on diversity and sat on many diversity panels, making the case over the years, I am armed with all the facts, and I wanted to share links to two reports. There's the McKinsey & Co. They've done a lot of research to show the business benefits of diversity, that actively use diversity, not just as a numbers game, but as an inclusive issue. And then there's the Rethinking Diversity in Publishing report. It shows one of the least diverse and socially mobile creative industries in the UK, and how current diversity and inclusion initiatives are not enough to bring about the sustained systemic change that needs to happen to create equality. None of this is new and none of it is unknown. It's a necessity, an urgency for removing the tensions in the systems and power structures that our speakers talked about. So how do we take this forward? As cultural organisations and towns and cities plan for recovery, that culture change has to be part and parcel of the recovery discussion. We have that opportunity now, and it's on all of us to enable an environment where challenge to current thinking and questions of identity, race, access, work-life balance, and the future are welcomed, And that challenge requires courage and a commitment to embedding diversity. We heard that a lot through this discussion, and that means it has to be in our thought process now to really enshrine diversity at the heart of all activities through systemic change, through representation at all levels, across all areas, workforce, content, products, boardroom, that can bring real benefit and hope to all our communities. And it should never stop, because if it does stop, then it becomes a side issue again. And I want to finish on the point about language and grief and trauma that Tarek mentioned, and what we do to support each other. As one of the few senior cultural leaders of colour in Nottingham and in the not-for-profit literature sector, I own my position of influence. I've worked damn hard to get there, and I use that influence to speak up for bolder transformation. I feel duty-bound to push down the anguish and overcome the fear and burden I feel every time I speak up. That struggle is really uncomfortable, and I am filled with a sometimes crippling sadness with the inequalities in a sector I fell accidentally and passionately in love with. But I am not alone. There are people here in this Zoom and people watching who have consistently banged on about diversity and equality. We need to continue talking, but also sharing the examples of practice, courage, and imagination. Every day brings fresh new challenges, but also hope. And I look forward to opening up the conversation more as we dream about building anew and pushing for a more inclusive and equitable sector. And my weapons of choice are books and libraries. Books for me underpin all cultural activities. Reading is a fundamental human right, and if we want writers from all backgrounds and communities, then we need libraries to nurture reading from an early age, which is why diversity of people, subjects, stories, and writers is essential. What is your weapon of choice? And to Jess's point, I want to show solidarity, kindness, and love. Thank you to everyone who truly commits to radical change, who carries this responsibility with an open heart and a spirit of generosity. You're making such a difference. And there can be no golden nugget from me without a literary quote from a literary giant that keeps me going. And it's in the words of Toni Morrison. There is no time for despair. No place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I really do hope that you do make it onto Thought for the Day one day, very, very soon. Thank you so much again to Tarek, to Jess, to Michaela, and to Kerian for joining for today's session, and for Sandy for that magnificent golden nugget. Our next session and our last one before we take a break for August is on Tuesday, July the 28th, and we are looking at capital fundraising and the challenges of capital fundraising during COVID-19. We're joined for that by Joe Bussey from the Science and Industry Museum, a National Science and Media Museum, Stuart Hobley from the Limbury Trust, and Esther, whose surname I can't remember, from the Royal Academy of Dance. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. And with that, I'm just going to get everyone to say a goodbye and a wave. Bye, everyone.